All right, welcome back. Part two of This Just In, continuing our conversation that we began with Jonathan yesterday on breaking news. Today, I'm going to share the lesson that corresponds with Jonathan's talk yesterday around breaking news that was designed by Common Sense Media Education for the 8th grade. And so if you've been joining us for this entire series, you are familiar with this page here, Common Sense Media Education. And once you are logged in, you can head right over to the lesson plans that we have been sharing with you. So I'm going to head over to the lesson plans. And we are in that 6th pillar of news and media literacy. Again, there are a couple of entry points into the lesson plans. You can filter by grade. You can filter by one of the 6 pillars of digital citizenship, or you can scroll through and find the grade and the lesson that you are looking for. So I'm going to hop right over to news and media literacy. And we are going to look at the lesson for the 8th grade today, which is called This Just In. And the essential question is, how should we react to breaking news? This is a great lesson. I love this one because it's very straightforward. So after I share the lesson with you, I'm going to share a strategy that I think would be perfect to use with your students to extend the conversation a little bit further. So you can see, just like all of their lessons, we have the essential question at the top and their featured resource, which this week is their slideshow that goes along with the lesson plan. We also have our learning objectives. So by the end of the lesson, the students will be able to define breaking news and understand why individuals and news outlets want to be first to report a story. They'll be able to analyze breaking news alerts to identify clues of false or incomplete information, and they'll reflect on the consequences of reacting right away to breaking news alerts. And Jonathan has touched on all of these topics in his talk earlier this week, including that great video that he shared where we watched the young woman share a news story that she had not verified first and the consequences of that. Key vocabulary for this lesson: 24/7 news cycle, bias, and breaking news. And again, if those are not terms that you are familiar with, you can pop down the menu here and get very quick definitions. Your standards, again, for Common Core ELA, the CASEL standards, AASL, and the ISTE standards still sit to the right, just like all of the lessons. So if you are aligning these lessons with standards in your classroom, Common Sense Media Education has it all done for you, so that is a quick and easy task. Again, I said this lesson was pretty straightforward. I think this might be the shortest one that we're sharing with you for this series. This one is 45 minutes long. So it's got this kind of great warm up where you kind of ask students to react to this image, and you tell your students, I'm going to call on the first person who raises their hand, so that you're kind of getting this sense of and giving them a sense of what happens when you're vying to be first. And that begins the conversation around breaking news and breaking news alerts and how the media uses those to manipulate the viewer and the reader. And so great conversation here you can see on the slide about how does that make you feel to be first or to not be first. What happened when you didn't get called on, but you really wanted to respond to that. So it's a great warm up. It's borders on a little role play first, which I think is great, and then leads into this conversation of how do we break down breaking news. And that's kind of the meat of the lesson. And so again, the lesson is scripted for you, so you do not have to be an expert in this topic to confidently facilitate this lesson for your students. Common Sense Media gives you everything that you need in order to facilitate this, including the handouts that you need corresponding with the slides in the lesson. So I'm going to scroll on down to slide 8, because one of the first activities that you'll do with your students after you talk about the terms and definitions is to look at these 3 headlines and to have the students take a moment to analyze them. So how do they, what are they seeing in these headlines that might be a little bit suspect or that might show that they are a credible source? And so there is a handout for students to go through this lesson and to complete looks just like this. So they are analyzing each of those for what I think is happening, and then maybe what is missing or inaccurate in each of those headlines. So again,
could you just go back one tab to the left for a second?
yes.
To the one, sorry, a tab to the left that says that's just in the green check mark.
Yes.
And up a little bit from there, there was an analysis that jumped out, that one right there, that jumped out at me when I was looking at this, that helps, I think, as a lens for the conversation the Kate's describing, which is to look at the difference between the nature of the person posting and this idea that an individual is looking for followers and a news outlet is looking for readers. And there's a difference between sort of, I mean, there's that weird influencer overlap, right? But in general, individuals are looking for followers and news outlets are looking for subscribers. And so of the three choices that are there, is an interesting conversation to be had too around motivation and sort of what's creating the desire and the viewpoint that's being shared. So I just wanted to pause on that little chart because I thought it was a great opportunity to have that conversation.
Yes, and you can see that playing out here in the student analysis handout, right? So you've got the Metro News, you've got your organization, but you've also got Sam, who is posting, right? Good old Sam posting these headlines. And so, you know, Sam as the influencer, how is he trying to gain followers? And Metro News, how are they trying to gain readers? And what do they do in order to do that? So what kind of language is Sam using, or what kind of language is Metro News using to get you to click on the headline?
The Common Sense too, I think, does such a nice job of realism in some of these. Like some of them can feel a little bit more constructed, but for example, the one on the right there that says, here we go again, skate parks are the latest casualty in a community that doesn't value the outdoors, right? Like you can totally hear someone sharing something like this with that clear bias and perspective to us who are looking for it, right? But it like sucker punches you, just like, oh man, yeah, right? Or also like, of course my community doesn't value the outdoors. So that really subtle piece that they capture in pulling together the lesson, they've done it over and over again. I'm really impressed with that research that they're doing. They also replicate it in their YouTube channel, and the degree to which they have thought out sort of circumstances, or they actually interview students. And it's amazing to watch how engaged kids are as they hear each other talk about some of these issues and really come up with kind of thoughtful, embedded questions that are great to tease out and have as part of the conversation.
Their student interview videos are among my favorites to share with students because they're very raw and real, and the students who are speaking in the videos consistently just come across as very authentic. And like you said, that's really incredibly engaging for our students because it feels like they've entered into a conversation with their peer via that video. The other thing that I like, you know, as you pointed out how realistic this is. So we've got Metro News, you know, which I'm going to recognize as a, you know, reliable source, right? That's like our local newspaper. Maybe we've got Sam, the influencer, who we can recognize maybe as an influencer, but that third source is called My Rights. And, you know, I encounter that on Twitter all the time. News sources with titles like My Rights or, you know, whatever, that seem on the surface to be legitimate news sources, but that are not, right? This My Rights looks like it's been developed by, you know, maybe Sam as a way to share out some news media from maybe behind the cover of what might look like to be a reliable news organization. So again, just the realism behind what Common Sense Media is sharing with students in order to analyze, I think is spot on.
And the language to around like what you need to know, right? I don't need to know that, but somehow I believe you because I do need to know it, right? It's the marketing piece. And I think I mentioned that my dad worked for the New York Times and bemoans the sort of shift towards everything having a price tag, right? Creating a huge part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So students will, in the lesson plan, it says, have your students work in small groups or in partners to complete this little analysis. And then they can go through and, there's your fill in the blank. So now they are thinking about, before they react to the breaking news headlines, slow down, and now they're going to use the language from the lesson to complete these sentence stems and to have conversations with their partners. These are, again, this is a brief conversation. This lesson gives this whole entire activity 20 minutes. So this is a very quick moving lesson. And then it gives another scenario about a canceled concert where the students then are going to do the same analysis, the same type of analysis again. So this one looks like this. So there are news alerts below. And so you've got CS Pavilion who's saying that, oh, we've had to cancel the concert. Please contact Ticket Chief to get your refunds back. And then you can see people's reactions, right? Sheena and Miles have both responded. Oh, I can't get through. And then Miles saying, oh, I think it's just being moved to next week. And I think we can all think of instances on social media where news is being shared, where people very quickly start responding and maybe creating fake news or misinformation on their own in the comments section. And we've got Metro News again, sharing a headline. And then again, we've got kind of that questionable influencer source, Summer Sings 14, who says, I just heard we probably won't get a refund because they say they only refund for bad weather. And so, of course, you can see how this conversation might swirl out of control very quickly online. And so it's asking the students again, this time individually, to think about how this all works together. So what's likely happening with this concert based on these news alerts? So what do you think is really going on? What clues are there that lead you to believe this, and what might be inaccurate or what might be missing? So again, it's kind of like, it's like the chart that they just did with their partner. So it's just reinforcing this at the individual level. And then the question, if you had tickets for that concert and you saw these alerts, what should you do? And I think that's a great question because, who are you going to listen to here? Are you listening to Summer Sings and you're going to freak out and post something nasty about Ticket Chief, on Twitter? Or are you going to contact Ticket Chief directly like CS Pavilion suggested that you might? Again, it's all about that slowing down and thinking about how you're going to react to the news before you share it or before you respond. And it just reminds me again, I'll just reference that video that Jonathan shared in his session yesterday of the young woman who was just scrolling in her bed, before she even brushed her teeth, saw a headline and quick, just shared it without any further exploration around that. And I think that's just so incredibly realistic that's what's kind of being recreated here for the students to think about.
You can think of three quick things I wanted to mention. First one is that especially as we're talking about like citation and appropriate use, common sense education has been very clear that you are welcome to take pieces of this, modify them, change them in any ways you want. So if something doesn't exactly map on to what you want to talk about, or you want to break it into pieces over the course of several days, they welcome that. They really just want to give you the resources. And I think that's a terrific, like a really generous piece on their part. The second is that both Kate and I have felt like many of the grade assigned can be moved, especially down. So like a grade 8 would work very well with the 7th or 6th grade, no problem. Sometimes the high school ones can have content that you really would want to examine carefully before bringing into a middle school, but you may also find there are places that you want to look beyond common sense education that are harder hitting depending on kind of what your audience is and what you're talking about. And then the third thing you made me think of there as you were talking was this question of how we might merge some of these lessons together. And the example you just gave is great around digital citizenship, right? Do you tear into someone publicly in response? Or do you just pick up the phone and put yourself on hold? And the pandemic for me has been such a great opportunity to have that pause myself. And it's like something bananas is happening, right? Like my internet has been going out constantly with this construction that's happening outside my window. And I have sort of been primed by the pandemic to remember the person picking up the phone is not out here intentionally like shoving his or her shovel through my conduit. And so it gave me, as I kept thinking, you know, like this nurse, this doctor, this lone employee who has no one else to help them out is not persecuting me, right? And so getting kids thinking about like, how do you want to show up, right? What kind of person do you want to be online in response to something like this? And there's a whole other series of one of the other pillars or threads of common sense education has to do with how you show up online and sort of how you want to respond to the world publicly. And in that, this opportunity to really merge. And so going back to what I said at the beginning, if you want to pull from that and this and talk about them together, common sense education just wants you talking, and they want you to feel confident doing it. So as Kate showed you, it always reminds me of like when you have to read those ridiculous scripts for standardized testing. We are seated in a room with our number 2 pencils. So you can literally read the script if this is uncomfortable to you, and then you can riff, you know, to whatever degree, even just referencing the slides and doing your own total narrative, they welcome.
Great. I'm going to show you a way that I would extend this lesson with my students, because like Jonathan said, these lessons are incredibly rich. I think this one in particular, probably because of the time that we are in and what our students are experiencing, I think begs for more conversation, especially because our students are plugged in for a lot of the day, and they are seeing bias and they are seeing breaking news. And I think that they have a lot more to say probably than what this particular lesson, I think this lesson would kind of crack open a discussion that is much bigger. So I'm going to share with you a strategy that I would use with my students to extend this lesson and to give them a space to hold that discussion, because I think they are seeing, and they're very aware of, that they're seeing so much on their social media right now that I think it just begs for so much more discussion. And so the strategy that I'm going to share with you today is a strategy called hexagonal thinking. And I'm going to try to not dive too deeply into the professional development around hexagonal thinking and what it is and how to facilitate it necessarily, although I will include a link for you that does all of those things. I'm really just going to very briefly explain what it is and then how it might work for this particular lesson. So hexagonal thinking is a discussion strategy that uses hexagons, like you are seeing on the screen here, that have terms and concepts from a lesson that you are doing. So for example, the breaking news lesson, or in this case, this was a hexagonal thinking map from the study of the crucible. So you pull terms, key ideas and concepts, maybe some images or some GIFs that represent different significant pieces of the content that you're studying. And then you really turn the students loose with these hexagons to have a discussion about how these different key ideas, terms, and concepts connect to each other. And while they are having those conversations about how everything connects, they are moving these hexagons to show their thinking around the connections. So you'll see that Arthur Miller connects maybe to John Proctor, that connects to McCarthyism. So every time a hexagon is touching another, it's representing a connection. And the students are having discussions about what those connections are as they are figuring out how to place their hexagons. And then you give them maybe some arrows to point out, I would say, point out your 3 key connections that you want to explain further. And you can think of all sorts of different ways to do that and to facilitate that. And that will be in the link that I will share with you in the resources. But for this lesson in particular, your hexagonal thinking tool that you give your students on Google Slides, for example, might look like this. So I have pulled terms from that breaking news lesson to start my students on the discussion around breaking news and using hexagonal thinking. So I grabbed this image here from the slideshow, that first image where it asks students, when you see this alert, how do you feel? And I love it because it's red, it just says breaking news, so of course it's going to bring up conversation and emotions for students. the concept of bias. And so students will go through and they will put the terms on the hexagons. And then as they have discussions, they will move the hexagons around. I'm going to group these two together to create their hexagonal thinking map based on what it is that they're discussing. Sorry, I think we've talked about how I definitely cannot click and talk at the same time. So they can move these hexagons around and start to connect them and have conversations about each of the connections that they are making. And again, I am going to share some professional development with you to talk where I will talk about, how to keep going with this lesson and really what to do with it. But I think that giving it the space for your students to have a deeper conversation is important for this particular lesson, because like I said, I think they're just exposed to it kind of all day, every day, and giving them a chance to have their own thoughts about it and have their own conversations about it is really important. And I often leave some blank, so these ones don't have words or images in them, and that's for students, for them to fill it in. So while they're having the conversation, what was left out of the word bank that I gave you, what are you seeing? So add your experience. And again, it's just another way for students to show us their world and how they're thinking about it. So they can pull in GIFs and images and add them to the hexagons as well, which again, I just enriches that whole discussion and the whole experience as we're seeing the world through our students' eyes. And I will leave you with these resources because, like I said, I'm not diving into necessarily how to facilitate this or really what to do with it afterwards, but I am including a link at the top. Making Thinking Visible with Hexagonal Thinking is some asynchronous professional development that I did in my March and April series around digital instructional design. So if you are interested in learning more about hexagonal thinking, definitely check that out. And then there are more resources for you to get you creating your own hexagons or getting some free templates for hexagons. And I'll talk more about that in that PD as well, so you can access all of that. But this is a lesson that I would definitely use here with the grade 8, this just in lesson around breaking news, because I just think it extends that conversation and allows students to show us their world. So that is,
those blanks that you have also offer a great opportunity for like a what else conversation. And one that I talk a lot to kids about, and you and I have talked about too, is the physiological responses that kids have to alerts and how their body responds. And the breaking news visual one gives that. But what about vibrations? What about noises? A lot of people call it phone stress as a term, but inviting kids, like, what else is this making you think about? And weaving that into the conversation can be a really illuminating, as you said, like to get their perspective and the things that you don't think of that they see that just pop up and you're like, oh, really glad we had this conversation because I did not make that connection. It also leaves room for your own sort of, Kate and I yesterday were talking about, it was a TikTok where are they still on TikTok? Like you can really get yourself. And so leaving like social media platform blank, and see what they say. It also gets into kind of cool conversations about, so what would happen if, right? What if you weren't checking your phone 9 times a day? What if do you need to know that information right now? Is the immediacy your own design, or is it designed for you? And so again, you can kind of, the thread in Common Sense Education is digital health and well-being, and really talking about some of these like appropriate limits and uses. And another sort of direction you could take this would be around why it's so important, as Kate said, to pause, and how many messages are coming at you to not pause that you're fighting against. So that, I think, is another sort of place where those blanks in hexagonal thinking and the other resources that Common Sense Education offer could really give you a multi-day conversation, or something you pulled pieces from over the course of several days, and I'm blocking it's not 1984 that you read with your students keep, but it is
Fahrenheit 451.
another dystopian world of the 20th century. But the ways in which you might then link it into a literature conversation or historical period, right? I'm thinking, I realize that my own lifespan in 50 years has covered, it just occurred to me that I didn't learn about the Challenger explosion until the end of the day, right? And like, if you think about, that's impossible now, right? Like there's no possible way that would happen. And then I learned about 9/11 because I called my car place and they were like, have you seen the news? I'm like, what? He's like, I can't talk to you right now. I'm watching the news. I'm like, oh. So that was probably half an hour in, right? And like the window of this information has become so immediate that there is no chance to process. And I imagined it, like something as catastrophic as 9/11 happening now, how differently it would unfold in sort of everyone's emotional responses. And in these, one of the things I really am impressed by in common sense education is that we know that the worst time to have these conversations is when, they're the heat of the moment, and that they give you realistic enough fodder to like really engage in the conversation, but also by doing it outside the context of something that's incendiary or like in this moment activating everyone, you can step back a little bit more. And so it's a fine line. The examples of the videos are excellent one that they really pull at you and they're so well done, but it's people, it's other kids. They're not sitting in the classroom with you, and you can pause them and talk about what they're saying and not have to simultaneously talk about, respectful language and let's make sure we're valuing everyone's opinions, which of course is really important, but is hard to learn all at once in a swoosh. So this kind of division, it may be a little unnatural, but it actually helps build the individual skills you need. So it's another way that I think by extending the conversation as you suggest, you get that opportunity to really kind of dig into it a little bit and get closer to reality, but not so much so that you're like, just white around the eye or red around the eyes. That's the expression.
Well, that concludes week 3. Next week, we are looking at fakes and hoaxes.
Exactly. Good memory.
Yeah. Which is another great and incredibly relevant and timely topic for our students as well. So I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.